Goodness gracious, I'm telling you, if nobody's told you you don't have your own experience, these right here, you think baby hairs, okay, don't know how to be subordinate. Gray hairs do their own little thing. They will be seen, okay? They will be seen. Anywho, welcome to Shay's Pretty Skinny, the podcast, right? We're trying this video deal as well as the audio. And as you know, we're doing everything except keeping it cute about self-love, resilience, and personal development. Now, today's episode may challenge some beliefs, maybe religious beliefs, maybe scientific beliefs, maybe spiritual beliefs, maybe all three of those things, okay? Because we are going to talk about mental illness, thought energies, psychosis, um, spiritual language a little bit, and the biblical idea of demons. Let's get into it. But before we start, let me be clear, okay? This conversation is not about mocking people or experiencing mental illness. Um, it's also not about denying psychiatric care, right? Medication, things of that sort, right? There's not going to be any conversation about whether you should, whether you shouldn't, and definitely won't be presenting any cures, right? It's not about turning suffering into entertainment either. This is definitely a deeper exploration of how we have tried to explain experiences of the mind um, that have felt bigger than ourselves, right? Because if we're honest, some of the descriptions in ancient spiritual texts sound very familiar to experiences that people still report today. And that raises a powerful question in my mind. And that question is, when ancient people described demons, what exactly were they witnessing? All right. So let's talk about it. I don't think we're going to do a presentation. Yeah, I've been going back and forth, but I don't think the presentation is needed. So we'll just get into it. I was actually watching a video on YouTube, and it was an old psychiatric interview clip. And the man being interviewed believed that he worked in intelligence, right? So he had some type of connection to the government or military, that he had traveled through time because he was saying that he can go in the future, but he had just come back from the past. He was hearing voices. Um, he talked about decoded lights and hidden signals. He shared that he was communicating with unseen forces and he was being psychologically tormented by these external entities. Now, from a clinical type of lens, a lot of people recognize features associated with psychosis, right? There's that grandiosity, there's that paranoia, those auditory hallucinations, because the interviewer was asking, do you only hear voices, in your mind? Or do you hear them in your ear, right? Trying to distinguish. Um, there was this symbolic over connection and then a whole bunch of fragmented thinking, right? When we're taking it in on the surface. But if you are able to check it out from a different lens, thinking about ancient people, right? They may have absolutely called this a demonic possession. And honestly, I do understand why, because the experience itself feels very external to the person. And that's the key right there. The man, he just repeatedly kept describing thoughts being removed from his mind, voices speaking to him, the tormenting that came from those forces, and then invisible entities influencing his consciousness, right? Pause right there. Invisible entities influencing his consciousness, okay? Um, some of the language has changed a little bit. we like, I don't know, people will say, I'm fighting demons, right? But they don't seem to be communicating that literally, right? It's a figure of speech. Something took me over, right? Like when Beyonce described, that's the first time I lifted my hands and something came into me, right? Um, these thoughts, they torment me. A lot of people talk about that, or the voices one, right? My intrusive thoughts one. So maybe the language has changed a little bit, but the human experiences aren't disappearing, whether we're saying it jokingly or in a very literal sense, right? So let's talk about thought energies a little bit because this is what I feel we are struggling with daily. In my field of work, we talk about thought energies, right? Um, I mesh the two, the spiritual and the physical, metaphysical and psychology, right? And the idea that thoughts are not neutral, but indeed, they influence emotion, behavior, that nervous system regulation, perception, and even our identity, who we think we are, right? Now, before anybody panics and thinks I'm saying thoughts are literal, like floating monsters, relax, calm down. But I do want you to think about this. Like a fearful thought, right? Repeat it enough to yourself or to someone else, it turns into anxiety, right? It manifests into anxiety, right? Um, Making people feel ashamed or a shameful thought repeated enough, that becomes the identity. I am ashamed. I shrink back. I feel less than, right? A hopeless thought repeated enough times, that becomes despair, right? So these thoughts turn into emotions that lead us to perform certain actions or decisions that carry us into an experience and sometimes a cycle of experiences that either propel us forward or keep us stuck. Okay. So thoughts, they shape physiology, right? The unseen then becomes seen. Thoughts shape attention, where we put our focus, right? And focus has a lot to do with bringing in the unseen. Thoughts shape our reality perception as well, and then how we engage that reality. So modern neuroscience is already confirming this for us, right? If you get out there and you do enough research, I mean, that's why TV is fun and entertaining, social media is fun and entertaining. But when you get out there with the real stuff, it's even more entertaining than what is curated for us in media. All right. So, from a metaphysical lens, some people would say that certain thought patterns become so emotionally charged that they almost begin operating like these autonomous enemies, right? They take on their own identity. So, not necessarily literal demons, but more like self-reinforcing energetic systems, right? And we're getting caught up in that energy, and that energy is becoming primary, and our own energy is cowering and taking a back seat to it, right? So we become led by that. Now, fear, it feeds fear, right? Paranoia feeds paranoia. Shame feeds shame. So that's what I mean about getting stuck in that loop. And eventually, the person can feel overtaken by the very thing that they're repeatedly energizing without even noticing it, right? So let's talk about Jesus. Jesus and the demons. Now, whatever you feel about the Bible and Jesus, whether he was real or not real, uh, we're just looking at these accounts as they are presented, right? So let's go to the Bible. Because what's interesting is that Jesus often healed people by speaking directly to demons, right? Come out of him, out of her, right? And that's fascinating because in many of these stories, they would say that this person's afflicted. Okay. So in many of these stories, the afflicted person is isolated. They did self-harm. There was an account where a man, he was cutting because of the demon inside of him. There was less emotional regulation. These people are hearing or speaking strangely, not of themselves, not with their not who their family recognizes them to be or how they would communicate. And then their thoughts appear to be fragmented, and then they just don't behave like themselves, right? Now, how familiar does that sound to the behaviors that we describe today for psychosis in individuals who are managing certain mental health challenges? So, one of the strongest examples is Legion. Legion does things in the Bible. Okay. When a man is asked, "Oh, what's your name?" He says, "My name is Legion, for we are many." So it's not just one demon, right? Not just one voice, but many voices. Now, whether you interpret that literally or symbolically, that is an incredibly accurate description of fragmentation. Because a consciousness that is overwhelmed by competing internal forces shows up fragmented, right? And notice something else. Um, Jesus separates the person from the condition, right? And that's what person-centered care is about as well. Being able to separate the person from their condition, okay? You treat the condition and we love the person, right? So he doesn't say you are a demon. He addresses the affliction separately from the identity of the person. And that is actually deeply trauma informed. So Jesus was out here doing that work before we could even define what person-centered care really even was, right? Trauma-informed care. And so this part is important to me too, because historically people use religion to shame people with mental illness, right? Call them the demon, right? And everything about them is it's loathsome, it's burdensome, difficult to deal with. But I want to just, give the opportunity to reject that completely, because the end result of a lot of gospel healing stories, it didn't end in humiliation, all right? It was restoration. And so when people talk about humiliation in entertainment, it's definitely the opposite of what Jesus's work was recorded being about, okay, what we think it was about. So when they say that they turn the system inside out, this would be a good example of that, right? Humiliation versus restoration. And when there's restoration, the person becomes calm and present. The person is reintegrated. There's a peacefulness that comes about them, and they're restored to community. Like when, who was it? Nicodemus, when he saw Mary, and he was like, only God could have healed her, like she's showing this calm, something that he was not able to see in her, that peacefulness he did not see in her before, but after she had been healed, he was able to recognize that in her, right? So they're not spectacles, there's not this punishment, but being whole. And that's that question that Jesus asked, do you want to be made whole versus this fragmentation that's going on, right? That matters, because some people experiencing psychosis are deeply terrified. Okay, not that things, it's a word with self, right? And they can become very exhausted. It can be overstimulating. It can be a feeling of internal torment, some people might describe. And honestly, toward the end of the interview on YouTube, and I will, where should I post it? I'll probably post it in the group, because I'll probably post this in the group as well. So I'll post that video in the group. But in the video, the man, he like stands up and he's like, okay, I'm getting tired. Like he cuts the end. This is enough. I've had enough. I don't want to talk to you anymore. Right. And it's not a negotiation. It's a notice for the interviewer. And that really hit me hard, because underneath that grandiosity and that symbolism, there's this suffering that he's going through. And you can hear him and you can visibly see the frustration in him trying to explain something, right? And the interviewer seems not to understand. And then at the end, um, he says to her, I'm just tired of explaining something that you already know. But the interviewer on the surface is just like, I'm not tapped in, right? So let's talk about the symbolic brain and go like a little bit deeper. Because the human brain naturally searches for meaning. We're searching for meaning in life. We're searching for meaning in the experiences that happen with us, right? And especially when we're under stress, like, why me? A lot of people will do that, especially when they have a belief in God. Why me, God? Right? And when the perception becomes dysregulated, like the symbolic brain becomes very hyperactive. And that's when you're going to see like coincidences feeling like something cosmic, or lights can have messages in them. When there's patterns and people see codes, um, there's our own thoughts that become external voices, and there's this inner fear that's being externalized as enemies or spirits, right? So ancient cultures interpret this spiritually. Modern psychology interprets it neurologically, right? And metaphysical traditions interpret it energetically. Hopefully that makes sense. But different explanations depending on the playing field you're engaged in. I always say, depending on what playing field you're on, different experiences and different explanations for the same experience, okay? And that's the important part. So I want to balance the conversation a little bit, because I do not think every mental illness is demon possession. That's a hot debate ticket around the parts, okay, when we start talking about mental health challenges. And I do not think people should avoid therapy either. I do not think that people should avoid medication or psychiatric care because of spiritual interpretations. People laugh at medication, like when you get into the metaphysical realm and the energetic healing, Reiki healing, so all those things, like all those things, right? Well, maybe you shouldn't go to a doctor. Um, but that's the magic being, right? There's a lot of things that happen in our ritualistic practices, our day-to-day practices. I'm not talking about doing witchcraft. I'm talking about waking up in the morning. Maybe you have a glass of lemon juice and apple cider vinegar. Maybe that's how you start your day on an empty stomach. And then you fast for a couple of hours before you actually take part in some kind of meal. Maybe you meditate every day before you start the day. Maybe you pray every day before you start the day. All of those things are ritualistic things. It's part of who we are and what we feel we need to cope and be our best selves for those times moving forward. Okay, moving forward in our experience. But the thinking of medication not being needed, I think that's something that can become dangerous very quickly. Okay. Um, Again, that pill symbolizes something. And once the thought is fixated on it and the result it is supposed to give, and I am talking about more than just placebo as well, the placebo effect, but all of it works together. And human beings are just more complex than just dismissing like all that we have access to. I guess I'll put it like that. All right. We are with these bodies, we are biological, the brain psychological, in our hearts, right? We feel like our emotion comes from our hearts. We participate in symbolic things daily. We're very social individuals, and we are also spiritual creatures. And all of this is happening all at once. Okay. So maybe the better question isn't, is it demons or psychology? Because that's basically what we're always debating, right? Maybe the question is, how have we throughout history tried to explain invisible inner suffering? Because that's what's going on in both realms, in the Bible and in the experiences of the mental health field today. There's an inner suffering that is invisible to everyone except the person experiencing it. Like we see some things on the outside, but we don't really understand the internal happenings. And so we see these individuals trying to communicate that in a way that we can understand, but we're not able to reconcile what's being shared with us, right? So what struck me the most in that interview is not the bizarre claims. It's never the bizarre claims. I watched a lot of criminal interviews too, where people have eliminated their partners in the heat of passion, right? And there's a lot of speak that is very similar that makes it seem like, and I talk about that movie Fallen with Denzel Washington, that makes it seem like there's a common theme, like this person is known, yes, in a different body, but what they're saying is very similar to the other person and the other person and the other person, right? So it makes it seem like a thought energy that is kind of driving the vehicle, the meat suit, if you will, right? So it's not the bizarre claims for me, it's the fragmentation because that's something that's very consistent. And the way it's communicated seems to be very consistent among different people, even different races, even different genders. Okay. So in this video, the feeling that his own mind no longer felt safe or unified is something that stuck out for me. And honestly, a lot of people experience like these smaller versions of that every day. Not a full psychosis, right? But those intrusive thoughts, those shame spirals, the anxiety loops, the internal torment, the compulsion, the emotional overwhelm, the self-hatred, right? And at any time that that cup gets full and it starts running over, those are the times when we see, oh, they lost it, right? That's how we'll be looking at it. But it's really just this build up, this little bit happening every day, building into a snowball that finally turns into an avalanche, right? So maybe the conversation about demons becomes interesting as horror, or less interesting as horror, and more interesting like metaphor. That's how I see it, right? Because when we think of demons, we think, oh, super scary, the horns, and all of those things. But I would find, if you want to keep it all the way funky, I might find the description of the angels a bit more fearful than the two-horn red guy yoked up. You know what I mean? So, I mean, questions we can ask is what consumes us, what fragments us, what torments us, what steals peace from us, right? What takes our peace of mind? And what does healing actually look like? That's how I like to approach individuals who are dealing with mental health challenges. You have to separate the person from the diagnosis because they're not one and the same. Okay, this person is managing this diagnosis, and everyone has different types of tools. They have a different character makeup, different background, and things that they've experienced that contributes to recovery dealing with this, right? So healing is not about becoming superhuman. I don't think that, okay? Healing is just becoming whole again and being able to recognize that. I tell people I used to say that it's got to be a funny thing to be quote unquote crazy and know it, right? But we definitely have a sense that there are people who we label as quote unquote crazy and they don't know it. But maybe it's not that they don't know something, it's that we don't know something, right? We haven't gotten to that place of internal torment, and maybe it's because how we're managing and how we're using our tools. Maybe we've just been blessed or lucky enough to not have the cup run over, right? So those are things that to consider. That's just a jump start that conversation. You already know how the podcast goes. It's not giving you all the information, but it's giving you a springboard to jump from. So we'll continue this conversation in the group Take the Leap on Facebook. You've been listening to Shay's Pretty Skinny, the podcast, and we're doing everything except keeping it cute about self-love, resilience, and personal development. If this episode challenged you, stressed your thinking, or helped you see these conversations a little bit differently that we're having, share it with somebody who's ready for some deep dialogue. I just like saying that because we always want, oh, it's deep. Let's take a deep dive. But let's get into some dialogue, okay? And remember that discernment matters, compassion matters, and restoration matters too. And I'm starting a new project and I need some volunteers. If you're interested, please hit me up on social media, mainly Facebook as Shade Toston, SheaToston. Let's talk about it and let me know if you're interested. I'd love to have you in the group. And if you want to participate in the project, I definitely love to discuss it with you. Until next time, see ya.